God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Please be seated. So it is customary at the time of annual meeting, whether it be in the meeting itself or in the sermon time on that Sunday, for there to be some kind of a state of the parish conversation or address. So it happens at council, and it really is more of an address than a sermon. But I want to have this time be a kind of sharing with you about what I see and the hope that I see before us. The texts for today can be a little disarming, especially that bit from Revelation, because what we just heard from Revelation about a new earth and a new heaven and a new earth and God wiping away every tear is a text that's often read at what? Funerals, yeah. So to have a conversation about funerals in the midst of an annual meeting can be a little bit of a downer, as the character that first debated Harvey Milk. I remember Sean Penn as Milk in the story told him, says, Harvey, you make good points, but you always have to leave them with hope. And there is great hope for us. And as I was reflecting on the text for this week, and then Thursday rolled around, and there are some helps. There are some good things that come from social media, especially from the Facebook, where it said to me, 7 years ago today you were doing this, and it reminded me that this past Thursday was the feast day of my very favorite saint of all. St. Brendan. You guys are good. You know me well already. I was on sabbatical in Ireland 7 years ago, and I went, as I started planning the sabbatical, one of my first intentions to make it real and tangible for myself is, as well, partially midlife crisis, and mostly because I couldn't afford like a new Camaro or something like that, I got a tattoo. And I got a tattoo of what at that time was the cross that represented my favorite Irish saint, which was not St. Brendan. It was probably the second most famous Irish saint after Padre. Anybody know who that is? It's a woman, February the 1st, St. Bridget. St. Bridget of Kildare. Probably the second most popular saint in Ireland after Patrick, and I think Brendan might come in third. Brendan is enormously popular in southwestern Ireland, especially in County Cork, where I spent the most of my sabbatical. And I found myself enthralled by his story. And I started reading before I went, and I read this little book called The Voyage of St. Brendan. And Brendan was an interesting cat. He was born in about 493 in a little village outside of Tralee called Fernet, born on the shores of a bay that was not unlike the Chesapeake, not nearly as big, but certainly founded on fishing, living from the sea, and also with beautiful croplands and farmlands nearby. And on June the 21st in my sabbatical, or June the 20th, around that, I was there for 5.5 weeks by myself before my family came over. And I decided before they came over I was going to do one last big trip that had to do with the things that I was studying. And so I set out one morning to go around the Dingle Peninsula, which was the birthplace and perhaps the place from which Brendan departed on his most famous journey. Now, what we remember Brendan for is that he was famous for sailing. Brendan is the patron saint of sailors. In fact, he is called Brendan, anybody know Brendan the Navigator? The Navigator, exactly. Why is he called Brendan the Navigator? Well, he grew up in a time and was a monk in a time when the abandonment of Christian pilgrimage, the abandonment of one's homeland to go to a new place that God would show us was very prevalent. People like St. Columba, St. Columkill, and others would get into little round rudderless boats called coracles, and they would get into the boats maybe with a little bit of water and a little bit of food and cast themselves off into the currents, and they would go wherever God took them. Columba floated on eastward, landed on the Isle of Iona, and founded the monastery, the famous monastery at Iona. Columkill floated across that far and around the bottom part of England, across what we know now as the English Channel, and in the 5th century ended up in Gaul and northern France and established monasteries all across that part of France. And other of these pilgrims ended up in places like the Outer Hebrides and started little monastic communities in these places to share the gospel. And this is part of what Thomas Cahill talks about in his book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. You know that book? It's because the Irish were on the edge of the Roman Empire, places to which the Romans didn't get, right? When they inundated all the way north to Hadrian's Wall and cut off that part of England, when they sent people like Anselm of Canterbury across, Augustine of Canterbury and Anselm across the Channel to Christianize England for the Roman Church. The Irish and the Celts had been there long before, and many of the sacred texts that then were sacked by the Vikings and the Goths and the barbarians on the mainland survived in Ireland and were copied and repopulated the European continent after the so-called Dark Ages. The Irish were guardians of things like literature and music. Did you know, in fact, that the Irish have more Nobel Prize laureates for literature than any other country? And certainly the most by population. Profoundly literate folks, and very much into story. And the story of Brendan is an important one. Brendan founded a monastery after Patrick, after Bridget. And in fact, there are legends and some evidence that Brendan went to St. Bridget to help understand how to set up a monastery in which both men and women could live, worship, and maintain their rule of life together. And he set up monasteries all across the west of Ireland, from Galway to the south. And the most famous of those was the monastery of Clonfert on an island in the Shannon River. Well, they were there. He had all these houses. Brendan was very popular, sought out as a teacher, was the abbot of all these monasteries. And they received a visitor one day, an old man named Brother Barron, B-A-R-R-I-N-D. And he came and he told a fantastic tale of a place called the Promised Land. And he said that he found this Promised Land when he got into his boat and was blown by the wind and the waves to this Promised Land. And he came with a message from God that said, Brendan, you are to go to this place. Brendan went and talked to the fellow brothers in the oratory, one of the small chapels, and asked for volunteers to go with him. This is a change in the Irish pilgrimage model. Because another thing that Barron said is you're to go to this place and that you'll return to tell people about it. The white pilgrims of Irish culture never left or never came back, right? Columba died in Iona, Columkill died in France. But Brendan was called through Barron to go out and to do this, and he understood that call from God to go out and do it and not be alone. So they ended up with 14 monks that came with him. They built a boat according to the standards that Barron set. A 15th monk begged and begged and begged to come with him, and they let him come aboard. Barron received a vision that said, well, here's what's going to happen. 2 of you are here for the wrong reasons, 2 of the last 3 that showed up. 2 of you are here for the wrong reasons, and 1 of you will receive a special calling, so only 13 of you will return. They set out in this boat, and as the legend goes, they traveled for 7 years around a circuit that included islands called the Island of the Sheep, which they think may be the Faroe Islands outside of Ireland. The Island of Fire, which they thought was probably Iceland. Then through a cathedral of ice in the sea, to the Coagulated Sea, which they think might have been the Sargasso Sea, where eels from all over the world come to breed. And that's why the sea seemed coagulated. And they did this round for 7 years. The Island of the Birds is where they spent every year at Easter time. And they would spend Maundy Thursday through Holy Saturday there, and then they received a vision that they were to go out to an island a mile offshore, and all of the priests, a number of the brothers that were with Brendan, were priests, would celebrate Mass on the island. Now Brendan knew what was up, but the rest of them didn't. So they're celebrating Mass on the island. They set a fire to roast some meat because, after all, what's Easter without roast lamb? And all of a sudden the island started to move. And it started to swim. And they had been celebrating Easter on the back of a whale. And they did that every year for 7 years. Same whale. Whale's name was Jasconius. And then they would go to spend Pentecost in a different place where they would be fed and ministered to, where they would have their feet washed by a group of monks that matched their 12 with this 12. Now, one of the monks with bad intentions stole something from this group, and so, of course, he died because that's kind of allegorical to what happens when one steals in the Old Testament, right? The stealing of Laban's treasures. The other one disobeys orders and goes ashore on the island of fire, which I think was Iceland, and was consumed by the island itself and burned into a fiery flame. I think maybe he walked into a lava field. The fourth was left, or the third rather, was left as a hermit pilgrim on one of the islands. But for 7 years they made this rounds. And on the 7th year they came to a place that they understood to be the promised land. And they sojourned in this land, and they saw wonders in this land, and they walked halfway across it and got to a river that they could not cross. And the legend has it that they were the first Europeans to set foot on American soil, perhaps landing in Labrador, in the maritime islands of Canada, in the 6th century, in an alder-ribbed boat covered with oxhide, cured with oak bark, and with a single sail on it. Well, being good 20th century people like we are, somebody said, well, this isn't possible, you know, right? The stories of Kon-Tiki, and what was the other one Thor hired on? The Ra expedition. A guy named Tim Severin in the 1970s sought to try and replicate this version. And the book is a fascinating book. It's called The Brendan Voyage. And he built it according to the plans that they received from this book, one of the first books to be translated into Latin from Irish legend and circulated around Europe. In fact, it's an enormously popular story in Italy, in Spain, in Germany, all kinds of places. It's a short little book, but it's a great read. And I think Brendan's important to us. And you know, I've been thinking about this, I've been praying about this, and I have held my tongue for a year in talking about this. Because I think that there is a possible Brendan around us. Not me or not anyone else, but the idea, the call to go to a place that God will show us might be for us. Now, I will confess I've also been reading a series of books that are fascinating and deliciously kind of tawdry in their own way. Any of you read the Starbridge series from Susan Howich? It's a series of 6 or 7 books that are set in the Church of England starting in the 1930s and going up into the 1960s. And each book is written from the point of view of a different character, although all the characters kind of show up throughout the books. It's a wonderful development story. The first and second books, one of the dominant characters and the one from whose point of view it's written, the second book is written, is a man named Jonathan Darrow, who was, by all accounts, a very striking man. His wife died while he was in the Navy during World War I. He waited until his children grew. He was a priest at this time, a chaplain in the Navy. And when his children grew, he went into the monastery where he uncovered and developed a gift that he had as a psychic and a spiritual director, what we would call in religious parlance a seer or a prophet. And Jonathan Darrow talks about the ability to see into the future and has conversations with a number of people in the first two books, which are Glittering Images and Glamorous Powers, that people ask him, can you see the future? He goes, well, I can see possible futures. To be able to see possible futures is not to predict the future, because there's always human choice involved. But the possible future is not always what's going to happen. It's always dependent upon how we align our will to that of God. And knowing that God will be with us regardless of whatever steps we take and direction we go. So, in the spirit of Jonathan Darrow, I'm going to dare to offer you a possible future for us at St. Mark's. Two, actually. One of them is consistent with how the trajectory of these books go, and wind up with a second series of books about Jonathan Darrow's son, but that's a different story. It ends up with Jonathan Darrow's son having a center of healing at an old parish church in London. In London in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, as the congregations dwindled there, some churches were set aside that would have special missions to the world in which they had their lived and moved and had their being. And that meant that there was no service on Sundays, and that St. Bennett's was one that they turned into a special ministry church, and it was a counseling center and a church where healing took place. There was a healing ministry. That could be a possible future. And with the potential for help, for transitions, and for Bacon Street to come with us, something like that might be one of our possible futures. And we consider and we're praying about that as we gather together as this collective group, and most especially as we gather together with Cindy, our consultant and coach, and in the vestry. These are the things that we talk, and most importantly that we pray about. And the other option, I think, is a Brendan option. An option where we gather together, people of faith who seek to do God's will and to go to the place that God is sending us, and trust God to provide places and support for us as we worship on pilgrimage. Because what Brendan did was pilgrimage with the intention of return to share a story. And I wonder sometimes that if a possible future for us is to go on this journey and continue to tell the story to other congregations that are facing similar challenges to that which we face, and make different choices based on our prayerful understanding and revelation from God about what work is ours to do. Today is the last service at St. Paul's in Newport News. Tomorrow will be, or next week, Bruce Cheney will be gone, and he'll start a new call the following Sunday at St. George's. And some of his folks will go with him, because they can do that now. It's not kosher for a priest to leave and take sheep with him, right? That's thievery, no matter who you are and what kind of shepherd you are. One just doesn't engage in sheep stealing. But what I'm wondering for us is this community of faith and trust and love and caring the ship in which we might sail to a promised land in the new future that God would show us? Now, one thing I want to point out, if you have the opportunity or are interested in reading this book, you will notice that they, more than celebrating the Eucharist, they engage in the charism of foot washing. Remember I told you on Maundy Thursday that there are churches, especially in the Anabaptist tradition, that sees the foot washing as the primary sacrament of Christian community. The willingness to serve one another and to serve the world around us. I didn't even realize it until I read the gospel out loud this morning, because I had already decided I was going to talk about Brendan. But we have come full circle, and we have connected with the gospel, because the gospel today is the end of chapter 13 in John, where he says, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. God has loved us abundantly well, has revealed to us the gifts of radical hospitality that Brendan survived upon and depended upon as he took his journey with those who were given into his care. I ask you to prayerfully consider if Brendan's journey might be an allegory for our journey, just as Brendan's journey was an allegory for the journey of Christ in the world. Leaving home and going to a place we didn't know with 12 others is vaguely familiar to my brain, because that's what he ended up doing. We know that there are more than 12 that traveled with Jesus, but at the end of the day, there was a small group of people committed to the mission, vision, and call of Jesus that did the unthinkable and changed the world by their witness and action, not because they stayed home and stayed comfortable, but because they went out, and they went out 2 by 2 and told the good news of God in Christ. Could that be a possible future for us? God knows, and she hasn't told me yet, but perhaps you can help me understand, and we can help one another come to clarity about what God has given us and what we are intended to do with it. I want to close with a prayer attributed to St. Brendan. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Help us journey beyond the familiar and into the unknown. Give us faith to leave old ways and break fresh ground with you. Christ, in the mysteries we trust you to be stronger than each storm within us. I will trust you in the darkness and know that our times, even now, are in your hand. Tune our spirit to the music of heaven and somehow make our obedience count for you.